The winter of 1887 brought the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes. In the Dakota Territory, where the wind carved through flesh like a blade, survival meant respecting the land's brutal honesty. But sometimes, even the most careful preparations weren't enough. Sometimes, the wilderness demanded a price that seemed too steep to pay. This is the story of two people from different worlds, brought together by a storm that would test everything. They believed about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly means to save a life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Whitmore pressed her face against the frosted window of their modest cabin, watching the sky darken with an ominous gray that she'd learned to fear during their 3 years in the Dakota Territory. The clouds hung low and heavy, pregnant, with snow that would soon transform their homestead into an isolated island in a sea of white. Her husband Thomas had left that morning for Deadwood, a 2-day journey to trade their meager harvest of wheat for the supplies they'd need to survive. Until spring, she traced patterns in the frost with her finger, creating delicate spirals that caught the pale afternoon light. Thomas had promised to return before the weather turned, but Margaret knew the unpredictability of prairie storms. They arrived without warning, transforming familiar landscapes into alien worlds where even the most experienced frontiersmen could lose their way. The cabin they'd built with their own hands felt smaller when Thomas wasn't there. Every creak of the wooden beams, every whistle of wind through the gaps they hadn't yet sealed, seemed amplified in the silence. Margaret moved through their simple home, checking their supplies with the methodical precision that frontier life demanded. 2 sacks of flour, enough salt pork for perhaps 10 days, dried beans that would stretch further if she was careful. The root cellar held potatoes and turnips, wrinkled but still good, along with jars of preserves she'd made from wild berries found along the creek. Their nearest neighbors, the Andersons, lived 5 miles to the east, too far for casual visits, but close enough that smoke from their chimney could sometimes be seen on clear days. Margaret hadn't seen that familiar column of smoke for 3 days now, and she wondered if they too had traveled to town before the storm arrived. She fed more wood into the cast-iron stove that served as both heater and cooking surface, watching. The flames danced behind the small glass door. The wood supply was adequate but not abundant. Thomas had spent weeks cutting and splitting logs, stacking them against the north wall of the cabin where they'd stay dry. Still, if the storm lasted longer than expected, she'd need to be conservative with fuel. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, large and lazy at first, drifting down like feathers from a torn pillow. Margaret had seen enough Dakota winters to know this gentle beginning was deceptive. Within hours, those innocent flakes would multiply into a swirling wall of white that could blind a person at 20 paces. She lit the oil lamp early, its warm glow pushing back the premature darkness that accompanied winter storms. The flame flickered slightly in the draught that seemed to find every unsealed gap in their walls. Margaret pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and settled into the rocking chair Thomas had crafted for her birthday, taking up the mending. That never seemed to end. As she worked, her thoughts turned to the life they'd left behind in Ohio. Her sister Clara had begged them not to go west, painting vivid pictures of the hardships they'd face. "You'll be so isolated," Clara had said, tears streaming down her face as they loaded their wagon. "What if something happens? What if you need help?" Margaret had been confident then, full of the optimism that drew thousands of families westward. The Homestead Act promised land and opportunity, a chance to build something of their own. Thomas shared her dream of vast wheat fields stretching to the horizon, of prosperity earned through honest labor under an endless sky. The reality had been harsher than either had imagined. Their first winter had nearly killed them both. Thomas fell ill with pneumonia, and Margaret spent weeks nursing him back to health while managing the livestock and maintaining their crude shelter. They'd learned through necessity, adapting to a land that forgave no mistakes and rewarded only the most persistent efforts. But there had been unexpected joys too. The silence that had initially terrified Margaret gradually became a source of peace. She'd learned to read the sky like a book, to predict weather changes from the behavior of birds, to find beauty in the stark landscape that others called desolate. The northern lights had become her favorite companions during long winter nights, their green and purple curtains dancing across star-filled skies with a majesty that made her feel connected to something vast and eternal. The wind began to pick up, rattling the shutters Thomas had installed last autumn. Margaret set aside her mending and moved to the window again. The snow was falling harder now, the individual flakes merging into diagonal lines that spoke of increasing wind. The barn, barely 50 yards away, was already becoming indistinct. In the growing whiteout, she thought of their milk cow, Bessie, safe in the barn with plenty of hay. Thomas had reinforced the structure before leaving, checking every board and nail. The chickens were secure in their coop, with enough feed to last several days. He'd been thorough in his preparations, as always. Margaret prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, eating by lamplight as the storm intensified outside. The wind had found its voice now, howling around the cabin's corners with a sound that seemed almost alive. She'd grown accustomed to this lonely music over the years, but tonight it seemed more urgent, more threatening. After washing her few dishes, she settled back into her chair with a book Thomas had brought her from his last trip to town. David Copperfield, by Charles Dickens, a thick volume that would help pass the long hours of confinement the storm would bring. She'd read it twice already, but familiar stories were comforting during times of uncertainty. The lamp flame guttered as a particularly strong gust shook the cabin. Margaret adjusted the wick and continued reading, though her mind kept wandering to Thomas. He was experienced enough to seek shelter if caught by the storm, probably waiting it out in a hotel in Deadwood. Still, she couldn't shake the worry that seemed to accompany every separation in this unforgiving land. Hours passed as she alternated between reading and feeding the fire. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it seemed to be gathering strength. The wind, now a constant roar, that made the cabin's wooden frame creak and groan. Snow began to pile against the windows, reducing visibility to mere feet. Margaret prepared for bed with the careful routine that had become second nature. She banked the fire to keep coals burning through the night, checked that the water bucket was full, and ensured the lamp had enough oil to last until morning. The storm might trap her for days, but she was prepared. As she lay in the bed she shared with Thomas, listening to the wind's fury, Margaret thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 years ago, she'd been a shopkeeper's daughter in a bustling Ohio town, her biggest worry whether the new shipment of fabric would arrive in time for the church social. Now she was a frontier woman, alone in a cabin while a Dakota blizzard raged outside, and she'd learned to find strength she never knew she possessed. The storm continued through the night, sometimes quieting to a whisper before roaring back to life with renewed violence. Margaret dozed fitfully, waking several times to add wood to the fire and check that the wind hadn't damaged anything vital. Each time she looked outside, the world seemed more alien, more completely transformed by the accumulating snow. By morning, the wind had lessened, but the snow continued falling steadily. Margaret estimated at least 2 feet had accumulated, with drifts reaching much higher against the cabin's north wall. The door was blocked, but Thomas had anticipated this possibility, installing a second exit through a window on the south side, where the wind typically deposited less snow. She managed to reach the barn to milk Bessie and check on the chickens. Following a rope Thomas had strung between the buildings for exactly this purpose. The short journey left her breathless and partially snow-blind, even though the wind had calmed considerably. The storm lasted 3 days, keeping Margaret confined, except for necessary trips to care for the animals. She read, mended clothes, and rationed her supplies carefully. On the 4th morning, she woke to silence so complete it seemed unnatural after days of howling wind. The world outside had been completely transformed. Snow reached nearly to the cabin's eaves in some places, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes that caught the morning sunlight like crystal. The familiar landscape had become an abstract artwork painted in shades of white and blue, beautiful but utterly alien. Margaret spent hours digging out the main door and creating a path to the barn. The work was exhausting but necessary. More importantly, she needed to clear a way to the road, or what she hoped was still the road beneath all that snow. Thomas would be trying to return, and he'd need to find their homestead in a world where all landmarks had been erased. As she worked, something caught her attention. Smoke was rising from a distant point to the northeast, thin and barely visible against the grey sky. It wasn't coming from Anderson Place, which lay to the east. This smoke originated from somewhere she'd never seen it before, perhaps from the small valley where the creek wound through a stand of cottonwoods. Margaret paused in her digging, leaning on her shovel as she studied the distant smoke. In 3 years of living here, she'd never seen signs of human habitation in that direction. Thomas had explored that area during their first summer, finding only the remnants of old campsites and hunting trails that he'd assumed were used by the Lakota, who still moved through this territory following the game. The presence of that smoke raised questions she couldn't answer. Was someone else trapped by the storm? A traveler who'd taken shelter in the valley? The thought of another person struggling, alone in this vast wilderness, troubled her more than her own isolation. She continued working, but her eyes kept returning to that distant column of smoke. It remained steady throughout the morning, suggesting whoever had lit the fire was managing it carefully, conserving fuel while maintaining warmth. This wasn't the desperate blaze of someone panicking, but the controlled fire of someone who understood. Survival in harsh conditions. By afternoon, Margaret had cleared enough snow to make the cabin accessible and had created a visible path that Thomas could follow from the road. The work had left her exhausted, but satisfied. She was preparing to go inside when she noticed something that made her heart skip. The smoke in the distance had stopped. She waited, watching the horizon for any sign that the fire had been rekindled. But the sky remained clear. Either the person responsible had enough fuel to last without continuous burning, or something had happened to prevent them from maintaining the fire. Margaret found herself facing an impossible decision. Every instinct told her to stay safe in her cabin, to wait for Thomas's return rather than venturing into the post-storm wilderness. But the thought of someone else in trouble, possibly injured or running out of supplies, made inaction feel like a betrayal of the very values that had brought them west. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, as she sat by her own fire, Margaret continued to wrestle with her conscience. The smoke had not returned, and with each passing hour, her concern grew stronger. If someone was indeed in trouble, every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death. She thought of Thomas, of how he'd react to finding her gone. He'd be frantic with worry, possibly angry at what he'd see as reckless behavior. But she also knew him well enough to understand that he'd do the same thing in her position. Neither of them could live with the knowledge that they'd ignored someone else's potential suffering. The decision, when it finally came, felt inevitable rather than chosen. Margaret would wait one more day for the smoke to reappear. If it didn't, she'd have to investigate, regardless of the personal risk. The harsh land had taught her many lessons about survival, but it had also reinforced her belief in the fundamental obligation people had to help one another when help was desperately needed. As night fell over the transformed landscape, Margaret made her preparations with the same methodical care Thomas had taught her. If she was going to search for whoever had lit that fire, she'd do it properly, with adequate supplies and a clear plan for getting home safely. The last thing she did before banking the fire for the night was to look once more toward the northeast, hoping to see that reassuring column of smoke against the star-filled sky. But the horizon remained dark and still, offering no answers to the questions that would determine her actions when morning came. Margaret woke before dawn on the 5th day after the storm, her decision crystallized by a night of restless sleep. The smoke had not returned, and her conscience would not allow her to ignore what might be someone's desperate situation. She dressed in her warmest clothing, woolen undergarments, thick stockings, her heaviest dress, and the fur-lined coat Thomas had traded for during their second winter. She packed carefully, dried meat, hardtack, a small pot, matches wrapped in oiled cloth, extra mittens, and a wool blanket. Her medical supplies went into a separate pouch: laudanum, clean bandages, needle and thread for suturing. The rifle Thomas had insisted she learn to use hung across her back, along with ammunition that she prayed she wouldn't need. The sun was just cresting the horizon when Margaret stepped outside, her breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. The temperature had dropped significantly overnight, turning the snow's surface into a crust that crunched under her snowshoes. She'd fashioned them herself from bent willow branches and rawhide, following instructions from a trapper who'd sheltered them during her first winter. The landscape stretching before her bore no resemblance to the familiar prairie she knew. Wind-carved snow formations created an alien topography of ridges and valleys that could hide crevasses or conceal obstacles. What had once been a gentle creek was now a frozen ribbon, marked only by the line of bare cottonwood branches protruding from the white surface. Margaret oriented herself using the sun and the distant bluff that marked the eastern boundary of their property. The smoke had originated from the valley beyond that bluff, perhaps 3 miles through terrain that was now completely transformed. Under normal conditions, it would be an easy walk. Today, it represented a serious undertaking that could easily cost her life if she made poor decisions. She moved methodically, testing each step before committing her full weight. The snowshoes distributed her weight effectively, but the underlying terrain remained treacherous. Familiar landmarks had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of white that played tricks with depth perception and distance. The first mile passed. Without incident, Margaret fell into a steady rhythm, pausing frequently to rest and check her bearings. The physical exertion kept her warm despite the numbing cold, but she was careful not to work up too much sweat. Wet clothing in these temperatures could kill as surely as any other mistake. As she created a small rise, Margaret caught sight of something that made her pause. Dark shapes moved against the white background about half a mile to her north. A small herd of deer picking their way through the snow-covered landscape. Their presence was oddly comforting, proof that life continued even in this harsh environment. The deer suddenly lifted their heads in unison, ears alert before bounding, away with surprising grace despite the deep snow. Something had spooked them, but Margaret couldn't determine what. She remained motionless for several minutes, scanning the landscape for any sign of movement or threat, but saw nothing unusual. The second mile proved more challenging. The wind had sculpted the snow into formations that forced her to detour, repeatedly, adding distance and time to her journey. Worse, the sun had climbed high enough to create a glare off the snow that made navigation increasingly difficult. Margaret fashioned makeshift eye protection by cutting slits in a piece of cloth, but the constant squinting left her with a splitting headache. She was beginning to question the wisdom of her decision when she finally reached the bluff that had been her landmark. The climb was exhausting, requiring her to remove her snowshoes and scramble up the rocky face, using handholds that were treacherous with ice. By the time she reached the top, her hands were numb despite her mittens, and her legs trembled with fatigue. But the view from the bluff rewarded her effort. The valley spread below her, its cottonwoods creating dark vertical lines against the snow. And there, nestled among the trees near what must be the creek, she could see a small structure, not a cabin, but what appeared to be a traditional dwelling of some kind, its conical shape barely visible beneath an accumulation of snow. More importantly, she could see smoke rising from it once again. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Someone was indeed down there, alive and maintaining a fire, but her presence might not be welcome. The structure looked like a teepee, which meant its occupant was likely Lakota. Relations between the indigenous people and white settlers in the territory were complex and often tense. Some interactions were peaceful, even friendly, but others had ended in violence and tragedy. She descended the bluff's far side more carefully than she'd climbed it, acutely aware that a fall here could leave her injured and stranded. The snow was deeper on this north-facing slope, and she struggled to maintain her footing as loose snow cascaded around her with each step. The final approach to the camp required crossing the frozen creek, its surface hidden beneath several feet of snow. Margaret probed ahead with a long branch she'd broken from a cottonwood, testing the ice's thickness. The water was shallow here, but breaking through could still soak her feet and legs, creating a life-threatening situation in the current temperature. As she drew closer to the teepee, details became clearer. It was skillfully constructed, its hide covering pulled tight and secured with wooden stakes. Smoke rose from the peak through what must be a carefully engineered smoke hole. Someone with considerable experience had built this shelter, designed to withstand exactly the kind of storm they'd all just endured. Margaret was perhaps 50 yards away when a figure emerged from the teepee. The man was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin clothing and fur boots that allowed him to move across the snow with an ease that made her own efforts seem clumsy. His long black hair was braided and decorated with feathers and beadwork. He carried no visible weapons, but his posture suggested complete awareness of his surroundings. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the snow-covered clearing. Margaret's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. She raised one hand in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent. The man studied her for what felt like an eternity before responding with a slight nod. He said something in what she assumed was Lakota, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. When she didn't respond, he switched to English, his accent careful, but his words clear. "You are far from your home, white woman." Margaret found her voice, with difficulty. "I saw your smoke. When it stopped, I thought someone might need help." The man's expression shifted slightly, surprise replacing wariness. "You came to help?" "Yes." The admission felt both foolish and inevitable. "Are you hurt? Do you need supplies?" He studied her again, taking in her snowshoes, her pack, the rifle across her back. "You came alone?" "My husband is away, trading in Deadwood." Margaret wasn't sure why she was sharing this information, but something about the man's calm demeanor put her slightly at ease. "The storm caught you too?" "I was hunting when it came. Found shelter here." He gestured toward the teepee. "My horse. Broke through ice 2 days ago. Injured her leg. Cannot travel." Understanding dawned. This explained the intermittent smoke. He was conserving fuel while caring for an injured animal. Margaret's medical supplies might actually be useful, though. She'd never treated a horse. "May I look at your horse?" she asked. "I have some medical supplies." The man considered this for a long moment. "I am called Running Wolf. You have a name?" "Margaret. Margaret Whitmore." "Margaret," he repeated, as if testing the unfamiliar sounds. "Your people and mine do not always meet peacefully." No, she agreed, but today we're just two people trying to survive winter. Something in her response seemed to reach him. Running Wolf nodded toward the teepee. Come, you will freeze standing there. The interior of the teepee was surprisingly warm and spacious. Buffalo hides covered the ground, and a small fire burned in a carefully constructed fire pit at the center. The smoke rose cleanly through the opening at the peak, drawing efficiently without filling the space. Margaret had never been inside a Lakota dwelling before, and she was struck by how well-designed and comfortable it was. A horse lay near the far wall, covered with blankets. The animal's breathing was labored, and Margaret could see the swelling. In its left foreleg, even from across the teepee, she stepped through ice where the creek runs fast, Running Wolf explained. Cut leg on sharp edge, swelling came after. Margaret knelt beside the horse, speaking softly as she examined the injury. The cut was deep but clean, though infection was clearly beginning to set in. The swelling extended from the hoof to above the fetlock, and the area felt hot to the touch. I have laudanum for pain, she said, and clean bandages, but she needs the infection treated. Running Wolf watched as Margaret unpacked her medical supplies. You know healing? Some. Frontier life teaches you many things. She mixed laudanum with water in her small pot. This will help with pain, but the infection is the real danger. As she worked, Running Wolf prepared tea from herbs he'd gathered before the storm. The bitter brew was unlike anything Margaret had tasted, but it warmed her thoroughly and seemed to ease the headache caused by snow glare. Your husband left you alone during storm season, Running Wolf asked, genuine puzzlement in his voice. He had no choice. We needed supplies to survive winter. The storm came faster than expected. Margaret felt the need to defend Thomas's decision. He would have stayed if he'd known. Lakota men do not leave women alone when snow comes. Different peoples, different ways, Margaret said diplomatically, though privately she wondered if the Lakota approach might be wiser. They worked together to treat the horse, Running Wolf holding the animal steady, while Margaret cleaned the wound and applied her limited medical knowledge. The horse was clearly suffering, but she submitted to their ministries with surprising patience. She is strong, Running Wolf observed. Like you, coming here alone. I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone needed help, even a Lakota person. Margaret met his eyes directly. Especially then, we're neighbors, whether we acknowledge it or not. This land is big enough to share. Running Wolf was quiet for a long time after that, tending the fire while Margaret finished bandaging the horse's leg. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested deeper meaning. My grandfather says winter reveals truth about people. Storm strips away everything except what is real inside. As if summoned by his words, the wind began to rise. Outside the teepee, rattling the hide covering with increasing force, Margaret looked up from her work with growing alarm. The bright sunshine that had aided her journey was disappearing behind rapidly gathering clouds. Another storm comes, Running Wolf said, his voice matter-of-fact but his eyes concerned. Big one. You cannot return to your cabin tonight. Margaret's heart sank as she realized the truth of his assessment. The wind was already howling with the familiar fury of a Dakota blizzard, and snow was beginning to fall with the density that promised another multi-day storm. She was trapped, miles from home, with a man from a culture she barely understood. But as she looked around the warm, well-prepared shelter, at Running Wolf calmly adding fuel to the fire, at the injured horse resting more peacefully now that her pain was controlled, Margaret felt something unexpected, not fear, but a curious sense of rightness. The storm had brought them together for reasons neither fully understood. Now it would keep them together until it decided their fates. Outside, the wind rose to a howl that seemed to celebrate this arrangement, as if the spirits of the winter prairie had been waiting for exactly this moment to test everything both Margaret and Running Wolf believed about survival, trust, and the unexpected places where human connection could bloom even in the harshest circumstances. The blizzard would rage for days, trapping them in a space smaller than Margaret's cabin, back home. But for now, with the fire warm between them and the horse resting peacefully, the future seemed manageable. They were no longer strangers fighting winter alone, but temporary allies sharing resources and knowledge against a common enemy. Neither could have predicted that this enforced partnership would save both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The second storm proved more vicious than the first. For 3 days, the wind screamed around the tipi with such violence that conversation became impossible without shouting. Snow drove horizontally through the air, creating a white wall beyond the shelter's entrance that reduced visibility to mere inches. The carefully engineered teepee strained against the assault, but held firm, testament to generations of refined design for exactly these conditions. Margaret and Running Wolf settled into an uneasy routine. They rationed their combined food supplies. Carefully, her dried meat and hardtack supplementing his stores of pemmican and dried berries. The injured horse consumed their primary concern, requiring constant attention as infection fought against Margaret's limited medical interventions. On the storm's second day, the mare took a turn for the worse. Her fever spiked, and she refused the water Running Wolf tried to offer. Margaret checked the wound repeatedly, finding the swelling had spread despite their efforts. Red streaks began appearing along the leg, a sign that worried her greatly. "The infection is spreading," she told Running Wolf, having to lean close to his ear to be heard over the wind. "In people we'd call this blood poisoning. It could kill her." Running Wolf's face remained impassive, but Margaret had begun to read the subtle signs of his emotions. The tightness around his eyes revealed his deep concern for the animal that was clearly more than transportation to him. "Stardancer has been my companion for 7 summers, he said. "She has carried me safely through dangers you cannot imagine. I will not let her die from my carelessness." It wasn't carelessness. Ice breaks, accidents happen. Lakota warrior should know his horse better than his own heartbeat, should feel the danger before it comes. Margaret recognized the self-recrimination in his voice, the same tone she'd heard from Thomas when crop failures or livestock deaths threatened their survival. Men, regardless of their culture, seemed to carry the weight of responsibility heavily. She mixed her remaining laudanum with warm water, creating a stronger solution than she'd used before. "This will help with the pain and fever, but it's nearly the last of what I have." Running Wolf accepted this news with a nod. "Medicine is precious. You use yours for Lakota horse. I use it for a suffering animal. The rest doesn't matter." That afternoon, as the storm raged unabated, Running Wolf began to tell stories. Perhaps it was the forced intimacy of their shelter, or maybe the shared concern for Stardancer, but his initial wariness had transformed into something approaching trust. He spoke of his childhood in the Black Hills, learning to hunt from his grandfather while his father traveled with war parties against the encroaching white settlements. His voice carried a wistfulness when he described places that were now off-limits to his people, sacred sites turned into mining camps or cattle ranges. "My grandfather said the white man sees land as thing to be owned, like knife or blanket, but earth cannot be owned any more than wind or sky. This difference causes much trouble between our peoples." Margaret found herself sharing her own stories in return. She spoke of Ohio, of the settled life she'd left behind, of the dreams that had brought her and Thomas west. Running Wolf listened intently as she described the loneliness of frontier life, the months between encounters with other people, the constant struggle against weather and isolation. "You chose this difficult path," he observed. "Lakota are born to this land. You came to it from far place of ease." "Ease isn't always good for the spirit," Margaret replied. "Sometimes people need challenge to discover who they really are." "And who are you, Margaret Whitmore?" The question caught her off guard. In Ohio, she'd been defined by her relationships, daughter, sister, eventually wife. On the frontier, survival had consumed so much energy that deeper questions of identity had been pushed aside. "I'm still learning," she admitted. On the storm's third morning, Margaret woke to an unusual sound: silence. The wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a stillness so complete it seemed unnatural. She and Running Wolf emerged from the teepee to find a world transformed once again. The new snowfall had been lighter than expected, but the wind had redistributed existing snow into fantastic sculptures that completely altered the valley's geography. More alarming was the temperature. The storm's passage had brought Arctic air that made their breath freeze instantly and turned exposed, skin numb within seconds. Running Wolf estimated it at 40 degrees below zero, cold enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes. Stardancer had survived the night, but her condition remained critical. The red streaking had not advanced further, which Margaret took as encouraging, but the horse remained weak and feverish. They had exhausted their medical supplies, and the animal's recovery would now depend on her own strength and will to live. "She needs rest and warmth," Margaret said, adjusting the blankets around the mare. "Time to heal." "Time we may not have," Running Wolf replied, his eyes on the crystal-clear sky outside. Margaret understood his concern immediately. The brutal, cold and clear conditions were perfect for travel, if one had adequate supplies and shelter, but they also meant that search parties would soon be out looking for missing persons. Thomas would have returned from Deadwood by now, finding her cabin empty and signs of her departure into the wilderness. He'd organize a rescue effort, probably enlisting the Anderson family and anyone else he could find. Similarly, Running Wolf's extended absence would be noticed by his own people. Winter hunting parties had scheduled meeting points and expected return dates. His failure to appear would trigger searches by Lakota warriors who knew this territory far better than any white rescue party. The convergence of these two groups in the current tense political climate could lead to tragic misunderstandings. Recent incidents elsewhere in the territory had left both communities suspicious and quick to assume hostile intent. "Your husband will come with guns," Running Wolf said, voicing what they both understood. "My people will also come armed," he continued. "They will see white men with weapons near Lakota camp and assume attack." Margaret felt the weight of potential catastrophe settling over them. Their personal survival, which had seemed the primary challenge, suddenly paled beside the possibility that their rescue might trigger violence between their communities. "How long before they start looking?" she asked. "Your husband, maybe already searching. My people, 2-3 days more." They had perhaps 72 hours to resolve their situation before the valley became a potential battleground. Stardancer's recovery would take weeks, far longer than they had. Even if the horse could travel, the extreme cold made any journey dangerous for all of them. Running Wolf stood at the teepee entrance, studying the transformed landscape with the intensity of someone reading crucial information. "There is another way," he said finally. "Dangerous, but possible." He pointed toward a distant ridge, barely visible through the crystalline air. "Old trail over those rocks, steep but protected from wind, leads to place where creek runs year-round. Warm springs keep water from freezing." Margaret followed his gaze, trying to make out details in the blinding white expanse. "You want to move Stardancer in her condition?" "Not want, must. At warm springs she can drink good water, find shelter that does not require fire. Medicine plants grow there even in winter. Willow bark for fever, other healing roots. And it gets us away from here before the search parties arrive." "Yes, but the journey will be hard. Horse is weak, cold is killing, trail is treacherous." Margaret considered their options. Staying put meant almost certain confrontation between armed groups who had every reason to distrust each other. Attempting the journey to the warm springs meant risking all their lives on a desperate gamble across hostile terrain in lethal conditions. How far to these springs? Half day in good weather with strong horse. In this cold with Star Dancer. Sick. Running Wolf shrugged. Maybe we make it, maybe we die trying. The brutal honesty of frontier life reduced every decision to its essential elements. Stay and risk others' lives in potential violence, or go and risk their own lives against the elements. Neither choice offered certainty, only different forms of danger. Margaret thought of Thomas, probably gathering men and supplies for a rescue attempt that could end in bloodshed. She thought of Running Wolf's people, who might interpret any group of armed white men as a threat requiring defensive action. The history of misunderstandings and escalating violence between their communities made such scenarios all too plausible. "If we try for the springs and don't make it," she began, "then we die with honor, trying to prevent greater tragedy," Running Wolf finished. "Better than living with blood on our hands from violence we could have prevented." Star Dancer raised her head slightly, as if sensing the discussion concerned her. The mare's eyes were clearer than they'd been in days, though she remained obviously weak. Margaret knelt beside the horse, running her hand along the injured leg. The swelling had decreased slightly, and the red streaking had not advanced further. "She's fighting," Margaret observed. "Stronger than yesterday." Strong enough for what? We ask of her. That was the question neither could answer with certainty. The journey would demand everything Star Dancer had left, and possibly more than she could give. But the alternative, remaining here while armed men converged on their location, seemed to offer even less hope for a peaceful resolution. Margaret made her decision with the same decisive clarity that had brought her out into the storm. To investigate the mysterious smoke. "We go. Today, while the weather holds." Running Wolf nodded, having reached the same conclusion through his own reasoning. "Prepare what you can carry. Leave everything else. Speed may save us where supplies cannot." They spent the morning making careful preparations. Running Wolf fashioned a travois from teepee poles and buffalo hide, creating a sledge that Star Dancer could pull despite her weakness. Margaret sorted their remaining supplies ruthlessly, keeping only essentials for survival and abandoning everything. Elders, as they worked, both were acutely aware that they were committing themselves to a course of action that could easily kill them all. The temperature remained deadly, the terrain was treacherous, and their weakened horse would be pulling a load across snow-covered ground for hours. But the alternative, staying put and hoping that armed men from both their communities could meet without violence, seemed even less likely to succeed. At least on the trail, their fate would be in their own hands, rather than dependent on the restraint and wisdom of people who had every historical reason to view each other as enemies. By noon, they were ready to depart. Running Wolf had carefully banked the fire and collapsed the teepee, erasing most signs of their presence. To casual observation, the valley would appear empty, hopefully discouraging extended searches. Star Dancer accepted the travois harness with patient resignation, as if understanding that this effort was necessary for all their survival. The mare's breathing was still labored, but she stood steady and seemed willing to attempt what was being asked of her. Margaret took one last look around the valley that had sheltered them during the storm. 3 days ago, she'd been a frontier housewife making a difficult moral choice. Now she was a partner in a desperate gamble to prevent potential bloodshed between communities that barely understood each other. The irony wasn't lost on her that their attempt to save lives might cost them their own. But as Running Wolf had observed, some risks were worth taking when the alternative was living with preventable tragedy on one's conscience. They set out into the killing cold, 3 unlikely companions bound together by circumstance and committed to a journey that would test every skill they'd learned about survival in the unforgiving Dakota Territory. The first hour of their journey nearly killed them all. The Arctic air turned their breath into ice crystals that clung to their faces, and the snow beneath their feet squeaked with the distinctive sound that came only with temperatures far below zero. Stardancer managed to pull the travois, but each step clearly cost her tremendous effort. Her sides heaved with exertion, and frost formed around her nostrils where her warm breath met the killing cold. Running Wolf had wrapped Margaret's face with strips of hide, leaving only her eyes exposed, but even with protection, the cold found ways to penetrate their defenses. Her toes began to lose feeling despite her thick boots, and her fingers grew clumsy inside her mittens. The terrain proved even more treacherous than anticipated. What had appeared to be solid ground was often wind-packed snow concealing rocks, fallen logs, or sudden depressions that could trap a foot or turn an ankle. Running Wolf broke trail ahead of Stardancer, testing each step and choosing the safest route, but progress was agonizingly slow. After the first mile, they were forced to stop. Stardancer stood with her head hanging, sides heaving, clearly at the limit of her endurance. Running Wolf examined her injured leg, finding fresh swelling around the bandages. "Trail is harder than expected," he admitted, his words barely audible through the hide covering his face. "Horse cannot continue." At this pace, Margaret checked their position against the distant ridge that marked their destination. They had covered perhaps a quarter of the distance, and the day was already half gone. At their current rate of progress, they would be caught in darkness long before reaching the warm springs. "Can we rest here?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Running Wolf shook his head. "No shelter, no fuel for fire. We stop too long, we freeze." The brutal mathematics of their situation allowed no room for sentiment. They had committed to a course of action that demanded forward progress regardless of the cost. Stopping meant death for all of them. Continuing might kill Stardancer, but it offered their only chance of survival. Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She began unharnessing Stardancer from the travois. "What are you doing?" Running Wolf asked. "The load is too heavy for her. We'll carry what we must and leave the rest. Blankets, food, tools, all on travois. Then we choose what's most important and abandon everything else." Running Wolf stared at her for a moment, perhaps recognizing something in her voice that reminded him of Lakota women he'd known. The practical acceptance of hard choices that frontier life demanded from everyone, regardless of their culture. Together, they sorted through their supplies with ruthless efficiency. 1 blanket instead of 3, food for 2 days instead of a week, essential tools only. Everything else was left beside the abandoned travois, sacrificed to the greater goal of reaching safety before nightfall. Without the heavy load, Stardancer moved more easily, but the cold was becoming a more serious enemy with each passing hour. Ice formed on Margaret's eyelashes, making vision difficult, and her feet had gone completely numb. Running Wolf showed similar signs of cold-related distress, moving with the careful deliberation of someone fighting hypothermia. The second hour brought them to the base of the ridge Running Wolf had indicated. The trail here was indeed more protected from wind, but it climbed steeply through a maze of snow-covered boulders that formed natural obstacles at every turn. What would have been a challenging climb in good weather became a nightmare of slippery rocks and hidden gaps that could swallow an unwary traveler. Stardancer balked at the first steep section, her instincts warning against the treacherous footing. Running Wolf spent precious minutes coaxing her forward, speaking in Lakota with a gentle patience that contrasted sharply with their desperate circumstances. "She trusts you," Margaret observed, watching the interplay between man and horse. "Trust must be earned through many seasons together, cannot be forced, only offered and accepted." As they climbed, Margaret began to understand why Running Wolf was willing to risk everything for this animal. Star Dancer wasn't just transportation or property. She was a partner whose welfare mattered as much as his own survival. The bond between them spoke to a different relationship with the natural world than Margaret had experienced in her settled life back east. Halfway up the ridge, disaster struck. Star Dancer's injured leg finally gave out completely. The mare stumbled, nearly falling, and when she tried to put weight on the leg, she nearly collapsed. The joint that had been merely swollen was now clearly broken or severely damaged. Running Wolf knelt beside his horse, running expert hands along the injured limb. When he looked up, Margaret saw something she'd never expected to witness. Tears freezing on the face of a Lakota warrior. "Bone is broken," he said simply. "Star Dancer cannot continue." The implications hit Margaret immediately. Without the horse, they had no way to carry their remaining supplies up the increasingly treacherous trail. More critically, they couldn't abandon Star Dancer to freeze to death, but staying with her meant dying themselves. In civilized places, such dilemmas had civilized solutions. Here, in the brutal honesty of the winter wilderness, only hard choices remained. Running Wolf drew his knife. "No," Margaret said, understanding his intention. "There has to be another way." "What other way?" "She suffers. We die with her if we stay. The warm springs. How much further?" Running Wolf studied the trail ahead, calculating distance against the failing daylight. 1 hour, maybe less, but steep climb, dangerous rocks. Margaret looked at Star Dancer, at the trust in the animal's eyes, despite her obvious pain. An idea began forming, born of desperation, but not entirely without merit. What if we splint the leg? Temporary support, just enough to get her to the springs. With what materials? Margaret began pulling apart their remaining supplies, looking for anything that could serve their purpose. Running Wolf's bow, made of strong, flexible wood, strips of hide from their abandoned gear, her own woolen stockings to pad the splint. "It might work for a short distance," Running Wolf said slowly, examining the materials she'd gathered. "But the pain will be terrible. Animals endure what they must to survive, same as people. Working together with numb fingers and failing light, they fashioned a crude but functional splint." Star Dancer submitted to their ministrations with stoic patience, as if understanding that this discomfort was preferable to the alternative Running Wolf's knife represented. The splint held, providing enough support for the mare to put limited weight on the injured leg. It wouldn't last long, and every step clearly caused significant pain, but it might carry them the final distance to their destination. The last hour of their journey tested every ounce of determination they possessed. The trail became a series of narrow ledges and steep scrambles that would have been challenging for healthy people in good weather. With Star Dancer limping on her makeshift splint, and all of them fighting the effects of severe cold exposure, each obstacle became a potential end to their desperate gamble. Margaret's world narrowed to the immediate requirements of survival. Breathe, step, maintain balance, keep moving. Her body had passed beyond ordinary fatigue into a strange state where willpower substituted for physical strength. She was vaguely aware that hypothermia was affecting her judgment, making simple decisions difficult, but she retained enough clarity to follow Running Wolf's lead and encourage Star Dancer when the horse faltered. Running Wolf himself was showing dangerous signs of cold exposure. His movements had become mechanical, and he spoke only when absolutely necessary. But his knowledge of the terrain never wavered, and his commitment to reaching their destination drove him forward despite his body's protests. The sun was touching the horizon when they finally crested the ridge and saw their goal below, a small valley where steam rose from patches of unfrozen water, creating a microclimate that supported vegetation even in the depths of winter. The warm springs Running Wolf had promised were real, and they were close enough to reach before complete darkness fell. The descent proved almost as treacherous as the climb. Loose rock hidden beneath snow created unstable footing, and the increasing darkness made navigation increasingly difficult. Stardancer's splint finally gave way completely just as they reached the valley floor, but by then they were close enough to their destination that Running Wolf could support the injured mare for the final 100 yards. The warm springs exceeded Margaret's expectations. Several pools of varying temperatures dotted the valley, fed by underground sources that kept the water liquid even in Arctic conditions. The largest pool was surrounded by natural rock formations that provided wind protection, while smaller pools offered water hot enough for cooking and cleaning. Most remarkably, the thermal activity had created a zone where hardy plants survived year-round. Willow trees clustered near the water sources, their bark providing the natural medicine Running Wolf had mentioned. Wild grasses, dormant but still present, offered forage that Stardancer could digest. They made camp in a sheltered spot between two pools, using rocks and the few supplies they'd carried to create windbreaks. Without a teepee or tent, they would be sleeping in the open, but the thermal springs moderated the temperature enough to make survival possible. Stardancer collapsed as soon as they stopped moving, but she was breathing steadily and showed interest. In the unfrozen water, Running Wolf began gathering willow bark while Margaret explored their new environment, assessing their resources and chances for surviving until rescue arrived. The valley felt like a miraculous refuge after their harrowing journey. Steam rose from the springs in ghostly columns that caught the last light of day, and the relative warmth felt tropical after hours in the killing cold. They had gambled everything on reaching this place, and against all odds, they had succeeded. But their survival was far from assured. They had minimal supplies, no adequate shelter, and Stardancer's injury remained serious despite their reaching a place where proper treatment was possible. Most critically, they were now even further from any established trails or landmarks that search parties might follow. As Margaret helped Running Wolf tend to his horse using willow bark tea and heated water from the springs, she realized they had traded one set of life-threatening problems for another. They were alive, but they were also more isolated than ever, completely dependent on their own resources and the hope that this valley's hidden sanctuary would protect them until they could find a way home. The stars emerged with startling brilliance in the clear, dry air as they worked to make Stardancer comfortable and establish their own survival arrangements. Neither Margaret nor Running Wolf spoke of their fears or their slim chances, but both understood that reaching the warm springs had been only the first step in a longer test of endurance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about survival and rescue. Tonight, they were alive in a place of unexpected warmth and beauty, three survivors who had defied the odds through courage, determination, and a partnership that transcended the cultural barriers that divided their peoples. The journey that had begun with Margaret's moral choice to investigate mysterious smoke had transformed into something far more complex, a test of everything she believed about human nature. Survival, and the unexpected places where hope could be found, even in the most desperate circumstances. Margaret woke to the sound of voices echoing across the valley, distant but unmistakably human, speaking English with the urgent cadence of men searching for someone lost. Her heart leapt with a mixture of relief and terror as she recognized Thomas's voice among them, calling her name with increasing desperation. She and Running Wolf had spent 4 days at the warm springs, nursing Stardancer back to relative health while surviving on willowbark tea, wild roots, and the few supplies they'd carried. The horse's leg was healing remarkably well in the mineral-rich environment, though she would always bear a slight limp. More importantly, All three of them had recovered from their brush with hypothermia during the treacherous journey, but now the convergence they'd tried to prevent was happening anyway, just in a different location. Running Wolf was already awake, crouched behind a boulder with the stillness of a hunter assessing danger. His expression was grim as he counted the voices. At least 6 men, possibly more, spread out in a search pattern that would bring them to the valley within the hour. "Your husband brings many guns," he observed quietly. Margaret strained to listen, identifying familiar voices. Thomas, certainly, Jim Anderson from the neighboring homestead. Several others she recognized from town, good men, but men who would see a Lakota warrior with a white woman and draw the worst possible conclusions. "They've been searching for days," she said. "They'll be angry, worried, ready for trouble." "My people come also," Running Wolf added, gesturing toward the eastern ridge. "Yesterday I saw smoke signals. They know the general area where I hunt. We'll find this place soon." The situation Margaret had tried to prevent by leaving her cabin was materializing exactly as she'd feared, only worse. Both search parties were converging on their hidden sanctuary, and when armed, anxious men from 2 cultures with a history of violent misunderstandings met over what appeared to be a hostage situation, bloodshed seemed inevitable. "I have to go to them," Margaret said. "Explain what happened before they see you. They will not listen to explanations when they see Lakota brave with a missing white woman. We'll shoot first, ask questions after." Running Wolf's assessment was probably accurate. The men searching for her had been tracking through hostile territory for days, expecting the worst. Finding her in the company of a native warrior would confirm their fears and trigger defensive reactions that could escalate beyond anyone's control. Yet staying hidden until both groups discovered them seemed even more dangerous. At least, if Margaret approached the white search party alone, she might be able to prevent immediate violence. "Star Dancer cannot travel far yet," Running Wolf continued, "but she can carry you if we make soft saddle from blankets. You could reach your husband before he finds this place, and leave you here alone when your people arrive. They'll think something happened to me. Better than watching our peoples kill each other over misunderstanding." Margaret studied Running Wolf's face, recognizing the same practical acceptance of hard choices that had brought them this far. He was right. Her leaving offered the best chance of preventing bloodshed, even though it would place him in considerable danger when Lakota warriors found him alone at a place where a white woman had recently been. The voices were getting closer. Thomas's calls had taken on the hoarse quality of a man who'd been shouting for hours, his desperation palpable even across the distance. Margaret's heart ached for the fear and worry she'd caused him, but she also knew that his emotional state made him more likely to react violently to any perceived threat. "There's another way," she said suddenly, an idea forming as she watched steam rise from the springs. "What if we make them come to us separately?" Running Wolf raised an eyebrow, inviting explanation. "The search parties don't know about each. Yet, if we can guide them here at different times, let each group see the situation clearly before the other arrives." "How do we control the timing of men who move where they choose?" Margaret pointed to the largest of the warm springs, where a steady column of steam rose high enough to be visible from the surrounding ridges. "Smoke signals. Your people understand them, mine don't. We could send messages to your warriors. Arrange a meeting time while I go explain everything to Thomas." Running Wolf considered this for several minutes, studying the terrain and calculating distances. "Possible," he admitted, "but dangerous. If the timing goes wrong, if your husband follows you back here before the arranged time, then we improvise. But at least we'd have tried something better than letting them stumble into each other, ready for war." The plan that emerged was complex, but offered their best hope for preventing tragedy. Running Wolf would use combinations of steam release and smoke to signal specific messages to any Lakota scouts watching the area. Margaret would intercept Thomas's group, explain her situation without revealing Running Wolf's exact location, and arrange for a controlled meeting at a neutral location. The key was timing and trust. Trusting that Running Wolf could communicate effectively with his people, and trusting that Thomas would listen to her explanation before taking action based on assumptions. Margaret mounted Star Dancer carefully, the horse's injury still tender, despite significant healing. The mare moved willingly but slowly, her gait slightly uneven but functional for the short journey required. She intercepted the search party on the valley's eastern slope, appearing suddenly from behind a stand of snow-laden pines. The effect was electric. 6 men spun toward her with weapons half raised before recognition stopped them cold. "Margaret!" Thomas's voice cracked with relief and exhaustion. He reached her in 3 strides, pulling her from Star Dancer's back into an embrace that spoke of days of terror and sleepless searching. "I'm all right," she said quickly, feeling the tremor in his arms. "I'm safe, but we need to talk before anything else happens." The other men gathered around them. Jim Anderson, 2 brothers named Walsh from a homestead further south, and 2 men from Deadwood she didn't recognize. All bore the signs of hard travel in brutal conditions, their faces burned by wind and cold, their eyes holding the wary alertness of men who'd been expecting trouble. "Where have you been?" Thomas demanded. "Your trail led toward the bluff, then disappeared completely. We've been searching for 5 days. Margaret chose her words carefully, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized and judged. "I saw smoke from our cabin during the first storm. When it disappeared, I went to investigate, thought someone might need help. Alone, in a blizzard?" Jim Anderson's voice carried disapproval mixed with disbelief. "The storm caught me before I could return. I found shelter, waited for it out." "What shelter?" one of the Walsh brothers asked. "We've covered every inch of this area. No cabins, no structures." "Not a cabin," Margaret said carefully. "Someone else was trapped by the storm too. We helped each other survive." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and growing suspicion. Thomas studied her face with the intensity of a man reading signs of deception or coercion. "Who?" he asked simply. "A Lakota hunter. His horse was injured. He couldn't travel. We waited out the storms together." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Hands moved toward weapons. Voices rose in angry, overlapping questions and accusations. Margaret found herself in the center of a circle of men whose faces had hardened, with assumptions about what her words implied. "Where is he now?" Thomas's voice was deadly quiet, safe, caring for his horse. "Thomas, listen to me carefully. This man saved my life. Multiple times. Without his knowledge of this country, his shelter, his willingness to share resources with a complete stranger, I would have died in that first storm. Or he took you captive, and you're too frightened to tell the truth," suggested one of the Deadwood men. "Look at me," Margaret said firmly. "Do I look like a woman who's been held against her will? Am I injured, mistreated? I'm telling you the truth. This man risked his own safety to help me survive." Thomas studied her intently, searching for signs of deception or hidden distress. What he saw seemed to reassure him slightly, but the other men remained skeptical and hostile. "Even if that's true," Jim Anderson said, "Indian with a white woman causes problems. People talk, make assumptions, bad for everyone." "Which is exactly why we need to handle this carefully," Margaret replied. "More Lakota are coming to look for him. If they find him with a group of armed white men, the implications hit them immediately." Every man present understood the potential for misunderstanding and escalation when 2 armed groups met under circumstances that could be interpreted multiple ways. "We need to get you away from here," Thomas said. "Now, before his people arrive." "And abandon him? Leave him to explain to Lakota warriors why he was alone with a white woman? That's not justice, Thomas. That's cowardice." Her words stung, as she'd intended them to. These were men who prided themselves on fairness and courage, even when fear made them react defensively. "What do you propose?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't going to like her answer. Margaret outlined the plan she and Running Wolf had developed, a controlled meeting at a neutral location with both sides understanding the situation before weapons were drawn or assumptions made. "You want us to sit down with hostile Indians and discuss the weather?" one of the Walsh brothers asked incredulously. "I want you to meet with people who have as much at stake in preventing violence as we do. This hunter has family, responsibilities, reasons to avoid conflict just like us." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with Margaret defending her position against men who were simultaneously relieved to find her safe and angry about the circumstances that had endangered her. Thomas said little during the discussion, but she could see him weighing her words against his own fears and prejudices. Finally, smoke began rising from the valley behind them, not the random dispersal of a campfire, but the deliberate patterns Running Wolf was using to communicate with his approaching people. "Decision time," Margaret said quietly. "We can try to manage this situation, or we can let it manage us." Thomas looked around the circle of men, reading their faces and calculating odds. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it properly. Equal. Numbers, neutral ground, weapons visible but not threatening. And if it goes wrong," Jim Anderson asked, "then we deal with the consequences. But at least we'll have tried to prevent unnecessary bloodshed." Margaret felt a surge of pride in her husband's words. This was the man she'd married, the one who'd chosen the difficult path west because he believed in building something better than what they'd left behind. The next 2 hours required careful choreography as both groups maneuvered toward a predetermined meeting point, a wide clearing near the valley's entrance where conversation was possible, but escape routes remained open for both sides. Margaret served as intermediary, carrying messages between the groups and helping establish ground rules that both cultures could accept. The Lakota party consisted of 4 warriors, including an older man whose bearing suggested significant authority. They approached on foot, leading their horses, weapons visible but not held ready. The white men adopted similar postures, creating a scene that was tense but not immediately threatening. Running Wolf stood slightly apart between the two groups, his position marking him as both participant and bridge between worlds that rarely met in peace. Stardancer grazed quietly nearby, her presence serving as silent testimony to the cooperation that had preserved all their lives. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation that frontier legends were made of, but rather a careful, methodical sharing of information that gradually replaced suspicion with understanding. Running Wolf's account of events matched Margaret's exactly, while the elder Lakota spoke of their search efforts and concerns about their missing hunter. Thomas described the white community's fears when Margaret disappeared, their assumption that hostile action had been taken against her. The Lakota elder nodded gravely, acknowledging that his people would have made similar assumptions under reversed circumstances. Slowly, carefully, 2 groups of armed men who had every historical reason to distrust each other began to recognize their common ground. All were people trying to survive in a harsh land that forgave no mistakes. All had families they were trying to protect. All understood that unnecessary violence served no one's interests. The meeting ended, not with dramatic reconciliation, but with practical arrangements. Running Wolf would return with his people after ensuring Stardancer could travel safely. Margaret would go home with Thomas, her absence explained by the simple truth that she'd tried to help someone in need and been trapped by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Most importantly, both communities had seen that their supposed enemies were simply people facing the same challenges they faced themselves. survival in an unforgiving land that demanded cooperation more often than it rewarded conflict. As the groups prepared to separate, Running Wolf approached Margaret for a final conversation. "You took great risk for a stranger," he said simply. "This is not forgotten. You did the same for me. That's what people do, help each other when help is needed. Perhaps, but not all people and not always." He paused. "If you ever need help again, send smoke signal from your cabin. I will see it and come." Margaret nodded, understanding that she'd gained something rare in this harsh land, a friend whose loyalty had been tested under the most extreme circumstances and proven unbreakable. The ride home with Thomas was quiet, both of them processing events that had changed their understanding of their place in the Dakota Territory. They were no longer isolated settlers struggling alone against the wilderness, but part of a larger human community that included people they'd never expected to call neighbors. That evening, as Margaret sat by her own fire in her own cabin, she reflected on the chain of choices that had led to this outcome. Her decision to investigate mysterious smoke had nearly cost her life, but it had also revealed possibilities for human connection that transcended the cultural barriers dividing their world. The winter wind still howled outside, and the land remained as harsh and unforgiving as ever. But something had changed in Margaret's understanding of survival in this place. It wasn't just about enduring hardship alone. It was about recognizing that everyone sharing this difficult land faced the same fundamental challenges, and that sometimes the difference between life and death lay in the willingness to extend help to unexpected people in desperate circumstances. The smoke she'd seen that first day had led her to Running Wolf, but it had also led her to a deeper understanding of courage, compassion, and the complex ways that human lives intersected even in the most isolated places on Earth. 3 months after the blizzard that changed everything, Margaret stood at her cabin window watching an unprecedented sight unfold in her front yard. Running Wolf had arrived with 2 other Lakota men, leading a string of horses laden with trade goods. Thomas was examining a beautifully crafted saddle, while Jim Anderson inspected hunting knives that gleamed with superior craftsmanship. The informal trading relationship that had emerged from their winter ordeal was transforming both communities in ways none of them had anticipated. "These arrowheads are remarkable," Thomas called to Margaret, holding up a stone point that had been shaped with obvious expertise. "Look at the precision of the knapping." Margaret joined the men outside, noting how naturally conversation flowed between people who 3 months ago had viewed each other with suspicion and fear. Running Wolf's English had improved significantly through regular contact, while Thomas and several other settlers had learned basic Lakota phrases that facilitated communication. "Star Dancer heals well," Running Wolf reported, gesturing toward his horse. The mare moved with only the slightest limp, her recovery more complete than anyone had dared hope during those desperate days at the warm springs. "Margaret's medical supplies made the difference," Thomas acknowledged. "Without her decision to carry those bandages and laudanum—" "Without many decisions by brave people," Running Wolf corrected diplomatically. "Horse lives we all live, because everyone chose difficult path when easy path led to bad places." The philosophical observation was typical of Running Wolf's approach to their unlikely friendship. He spoke often of choices and their consequences, viewing their survival as the result of multiple people making difficult moral decisions rather than simple luck or coincidence. "Speaking of difficult paths," Margaret said, "I have news that affects everyone." The men turned toward her with the respectful attention that had become customary when she spoke about matters affecting both communities. Her role as mediator and translator between cultures had evolved naturally from the circumstances of their first meeting. The territorial government is sending a delegation to investigate reports of peaceful cooperation between settlers and Lakota. In this area, she continued, they'll arrive next week. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Government attention was rarely benevolent when it came to relations between white settlers and native peoples. Official policy favored separation and control rather than the organic cooperation that had developed in their region. What kind of investigation? Thomas asked. The kind that could end badly for everyone if they find evidence of what they consider irregular arrangements, Margaret replied carefully. The trading relationships, shared hunting grounds, and mutual assistance agreements that had emerged over the winter existed in a legal grey area that territorial authorities might view as dangerous precedents. If official policy was to keep the communities separate and suspicious of each other, their success in finding common ground could be seen as a threat to established order. We have broken no laws, Running Wolf observed. Trade between peoples is ancient practice, but not between our peoples, according to some officials, Thomas said grimly. The territorial governor has been under pressure to maintain firmer boundaries. Margaret had learned about the coming investigation through letters from her sister. In Ohio, whose husband worked in territorial administration, the report had mentioned concerning accounts of unauthorized fraternization and potential security risks posed by informal agreements. What do they expect to find? Asked White. Elk, one of Running Wolf's companions, who spoke excellent English. Evidence that we're either being deceived by duplicitous Indians or that we're collaborating with potential hostiles, Thomas answered bluntly. Neither interpretation ends well for any of us. The men considered this soberly. Their successful cooperation had created practical benefits for both communities. Improved trade goods, shared knowledge about weather patterns and game movements, mutual assistance during emergencies. But these advantages meant nothing if government authorities decided their arrangements violated official policy. Perhaps we should suspend contact until the investigation is complete, suggested Jim Anderson. Avoid giving them anything to criticize. Hiding. A good thing makes it look like a bad thing, Running Wolf replied. If what we do is right, should not fear showing it to anyone. Margaret found herself once again in the position of bridging different perspectives and finding solutions that served everyone's interests. The pattern had become familiar over the months, practical problems arising that required careful navigation between different cultural approaches and competing concerns. There might be a way to present our situation that satisfies their concerns while protecting what we've built, she said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. Explain, Thomas prompted. What if we formalize some of our arrangements, create official agreements that follow territorial guidelines but preserve the substance of our cooperation? The concept was complex but potentially workable. Instead of informal trading relationships, they could establish licensed commercial exchanges. Rather than casual mutual assistance, they could create documented emergency cooperation protocols. The substance would remain the same, but the form would satisfy bureaucratic requirements. Government likes papers, White Elk observed with dry humor. Many papers make officials happy even when they say the same things as a few words between. Honest people. It's worth trying, Thomas agreed. Better than pretending our friendships don't exist. Over the following days, Margaret found herself serving as secretary, translator, and diplomatic coordinator as both communities worked to document their relationships in terms that would satisfy official scrutiny. The process revealed how much their cooperation had expanded beyond simple survival assistance. Lakota knowledge of seasonal patterns had helped several settler families improve their crop timing and yields. Settler medical supplies and techniques had prevented deaths from injuries and illnesses in the Lakota camp. Shared hunting grounds had provided more game for everyone while reducing conflicts over territory. Most significantly, the children from both communities had begun learning from each other. Young Lakota men taught settler boys advanced tracking and hunting skills, while settler girls shared literacy and numeracy with Lakota children. These educational exchanges were creating a generation that viewed cultural differences as resources to be shared rather than barriers to be maintained. This is what the government fears most, Running Wolf observed as they documented the teaching arrangements. Children who see no enemies, only neighbors. Margaret understood his concern. Their success in building bridges between communities challenged fundamental assumptions about racial separation that underpinned much of territorial policy. If Lakota and white children could learn together and play together, it became harder to justify laws that kept their parents apart. The investigation team arrived on a Tuesday morning in early May, consisting of 3 men in formal suits who looked distinctly uncomfortable with frontier conditions. Their leader, a thin man named Aldrich, spoke with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to urban environments and bureaucratic procedures. "We're here to assess reports of irregular contacts between settler families and local Indian populations," Aldrich announced during his first meeting with Thomas and several other community leaders. "Specifically, allegations of unauthorized trading relationships and collaborative arrangements that may violate territorial guidelines." Thomas presented their carefully prepared documentation with the same methodical precision he brought to farming. Each agreement was properly formatted. Each arrangement fell within legal boundaries as they understood them, and each cooperative activity could be justified in terms of mutual benefit and community safety. Aldrich reviewed the papers with obvious skepticism, clearly expecting to find evidence of the naive colonists being deceived by cunning natives, or alternatively, proof of dangerous fraternization that threatened territorial security. Instead, he found a comprehensive system of formal agreements that addressed practical needs while respecting legal requirements. More troubling for his preconceptions, he found evidence of genuine mutual respect and shared prosperity rather than exploitation or conflict. "These arrangements appear unusually extensive," he commented after reviewing the trading agreements. "Extensive. Cooperation serves everyone's interests," Margaret replied. "We've found that working together produces better outcomes than working at cross purposes." "But surely you understand the security implications of close contact with Indian populations? The potential for intelligence gathering, for coordinated actions against territorial authority." The question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that drove much official policy. Authorities assumed that any cooperation between communities was inherently threatening to government control, rather than recognizing that successful cooperation actually created stability and reduced the likelihood of conflict. "With respect, sir," Thomas said carefully, "we've found that people who trade together and help each other during emergencies are less likely to fight each other, not more likely to conspire against distant authorities." The investigation continued for a week, with Aldrich and his colleagues interviewing residents from both communities and observing their interactions. Margaret watched nervously as the officials tried to find evidence of deception, coercion, or hidden agendas in relationships that had grown naturally from shared challenges and mutual respect. The breakthrough came when little Sarah Anderson, Jim's 6-year-old daughter, demonstrated her ability to count to 20 in both English and Lakota during one of the interviews. When Aldrich asked where she'd learned the Lakota numbers, she cheerfully explained that her friend Bright Feather had taught her in exchange for learning English letters. "You allow your children to associate with Indian children?" Aldrich asked, Jim with obvious disapproval. "I allow my children to learn from their neighbors," Jim replied firmly. "Same as I learned carpentry from my German neighbor back in Pennsylvania, or my wife learned herb lore from the French woman who lived down the creek. But surely you recognize the differences in the situation." "What differences? People are people. Good ones teach children useful things, bad ones don't. Color of their skin doesn't change that basic truth." The official's discomfort was obvious, but he couldn't argue with the results. The children in both communities were healthier, better educated in practical skills, and more confident than their counterparts in areas where cultural isolation was maintained. On his final day, Aldrich requested a private meeting with Margaret. She suspected he viewed her as either the naive victim of an elaborate deception or the dangerous instigator of unauthorized racial mixing. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began formally, "you understand that your situation has attracted considerable attention in territorial circles. I understand that helping people in need sometimes creates complications for bureaucrats," she replied evenly. "That's not how I would characterize the concerns. There are questions about precedent, about the implications of these arrangements for broader territorial policy." Margaret studied the man's face, recognizing genuine confusion beneath the official disapproval. Aldrich wasn't malicious, merely trapped within a system that valued theoretical principles over practical results. "Mr. Aldrich," she said carefully, "what exactly do you think we've done wrong here? It's not a matter of right and wrong, it's a matter of proper procedures and established guidelines, which we've followed to the letter, as your review of our documentation confirmed." "Yes, but the spirit of those guidelines is to promote safety, prosperity, and peaceful relations between communities, which we've achieved more successfully than most regions under your administration." The conversation continued for an hour, with Margaret gradually drawing Aldrich into acknowledging that their community's approach had produced measurably better outcomes than the official policies he was tasked with enforcing. Lower crime rates, better crop yields, reduced incidents of conflict, improved child mortality rates. Every metric that territorial authorities claimed to value showed improvement in their area compared to regions where cultural separation was rigidly maintained. "The problem," Aldrich finally admitted, "is that your success makes other administrators look inadequate. If cooperation works here, why isn't it being tried elsewhere?" "Perhaps," Margaret suggested gently, "that's a question for your superiors to consider." The investigation concluded with a report that praised the area's stability and prosperity while carefully avoiding any recommendation that their approach be adopted elsewhere. Aldrich and his colleagues departed with obvious relief, leaving behind communities that had been forced to examine and articulate the principles underlying their unlikely success. "Government man seemed troubled by happiness," Running Wolf observed as they watched the official's wagon disappear over the eastern ridge. "Troubled by anything that doesn't fit their expectations," Thomas corrected. "But I think he'll leave us alone." Margaret wasn't entirely convinced. The attention they'd received suggested that their experiment in cross-cultural cooperation was being watched by people who might have reasons to see it fail. Success could be as dangerous as failure if it challenged established interests or threatened comfortable assumptions. But for now, they had survived official scrutiny while preserving the relationships that had transformed their understanding of what was possible in the Dakota Territory. Children continued learning from each other, adults continued trading and sharing knowledge, and both communities continued prospering in ways that would have been impossible without their unlikely partnership. As summer arrived, and the harsh winter that had brought them together became memory, Margaret often reflected on the chain of choices that had led to their current situation. Her decision to investigate mysterious smoke had set in motion events that challenged everything she'd believed about survival, community, and the possibilities for human cooperation in harsh circumstances. The warm springs where she and Running Wolf had sheltered Star Dancer had become a regular meeting place for both communities, a neutral ground where children played together while adults conducted business and shared stories. The location seemed fitting, a place where unexpected warmth emerged from the frozen ground, sustaining life in the most unlikely circumstances. What had begun as a simple moral choice to help someone in need had evolved into something far more complex and significant, a working demonstration that people from different cultures could find common ground, even in the most challenging environments. The territorial investigation had confirmed what Margaret had suspected from the beginning. Their success was both an achievement and a threat, proof that alternative approaches were possible, but also evidence that official policies might be based on false assumptions about human nature and cultural interaction. As she stood in her garden that evening, watching Running Wolf's children play with settler children while their parents discussed plans for the coming harvest, Margaret understood that they had created something precious and fragile, a community that transcended the boundaries others considered fixed and permanent. Whether it would survive the larger forces that sought to maintain separation and suspicion remained to be seen. But for now, in this small corner of the Dakota Territory, the smoke she'd seen during that long-ago blizzard had led to something remarkable, proof that courage, compassion, and practical cooperation could overcome even the deepest cultural divides when people chose to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies. 1 year after the territorial investigation, Margaret received a letter that would test everything their communities had built together. The envelope bore the official seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and its contents threatened to destroy the delicate peace they had worked so hard to create. The letter informed her that the government was establishing a new reservation system that would require all Lakota in the territory to relocate to designated lands 200 miles south. The relocation was to be completed within 6 months, with no exceptions for existing arrangements or individual circumstances. Margaret read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Running Wolf and his people would be forced to abandon their traditional hunting grounds, their seasonal camps, and the cooperative relationships they had built with settler families. The warm springs that had become a symbol of cross-cultural cooperation would be left empty, its role as neutral meeting ground eliminated by bureaucratic decree. She found Thomas in the barn, repairing harness leather with the methodical patience that characterized his approach to most problems. When she shared the letter's contents, he set down his tools and stared at her with the expression of a man processing information too large to immediately comprehend. 6 months, he repeated, slowly. They're giving people 6 months to abandon everything they've known for generations. It gets worse, Margaret continued. The letter mentions that any white settlers found maintaining contact with Indians after the relocation will face federal charges for interfering with official policy. Thomas stood up, pacing the small confines of the barn with restless energy. So they're not just destroying their community, they're criminalizing our friendship. That appears to be the intention. The cruelty of the policy was breathtaking in its scope. Not content with separating the communities geographically, the government was threatening legal action against anyone who maintained the personal relationships that had proven so beneficial to both groups. Margaret thought of Bright Feather, the young Lakota girl who had been teaching her basic horsemanship in exchange for reading lessons. She thought of White Elk's wife, Morning Star, who had shown her how to identify and prepare medicinal plants that could save lives during frontier emergencies. These relationships had enriched her life immeasurably, but they would soon become criminal acts punishable by federal law. We have to tell them, Thomas said, though his voice carried no enthusiasm for the task. I know, but not just Running Wolf. Everyone needs to hear this together. They arranged a gathering at the warm springs for the following evening, using the smoke signal system that had become their standard method of calling community meetings. By sunset, representatives from both communities had assembled around the largest of the thermal pools, their faces reflecting the gravity they sensed in the unusual timing of the meeting. Margaret stood to address the group, the official letter feeling heavy in her hands, despite its few pages. The faces looking back at her included people who had become genuine friends over the past year, Lakota elders who had shared their knowledge of the land, settler families who had opened their homes to Indian children, young people from both cultures who had grown to see each other as simply neighbors. "I've received communication from the territorial government," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "The Bureau of Indian Affairs has issued new regulations that will affect all of us." She read the letter aloud, pausing frequently to allow the full impact of each provision to sink in. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle bubbling of the springs and the distant call of a night bird. Running Wolf was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled, despite the magnitude of what he had just heard. "They give us 6 months to abandon our grandfathers' graves, our sacred places, our homes, as if 20 generations of connection to this land means nothing." "It's not just about land," added White Elk's wife, Morning Star. "The new reservation is in territory that belongs to other tribes. We will be strangers there, dependent on government supplies, cut off from everything. That makes us who we are." Old Man Henderson, a grizzled settler who had initially been skeptical of cooperation with the Lakota, shook his head slowly. "This is wrong. Plain and simple wrong. Government's got no business breaking up communities that work." "But what choice do we have?" asked young Billy Walsh, whose family had benefited enormously from Lakota hunting guidance. "It's federal law. Disobeying means prison, maybe worse." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of connections that had developed between the communities. Children from both cultures had formed friendships that transcended racial boundaries. Adults had developed business partnerships that provided crucial income for their families. Elderly people from both groups had found comfort in sharing stories and wisdom across cultural lines. "There must be legal ways to challenge this," suggested Jim Anderson. "Territorial courts, federal appeals, something." Running Wolf's grandfather, a man whose advanced age commanded respect from everyone present, spoke for the first time that evening. His words were in Lakota, translated by Running Wolf for the benefit of the settlers. "Grandfather says the law is like winter wind. It comes whether we wish it or not, and we must adapt or die. But he also says that sometimes the strongest trees survive winter by bending, not by standing rigid against the storm." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Thomas asked. "Perhaps," Running Wolf said slowly, "it means we do not fight the law directly, but we find ways to preserve what matters most despite the law." The idea that began to emerge from their discussion was audacious and risky, but it offered hope where none had seemed to exist. Rather than accepting complete separation, they would explore ways to maintain their connections while technically complying with the new regulations. Some Lakota families might relocate as required, but return seasonally for traditional activities that could be classified as legal under federal hunting and gathering provisions. Settler families might establish legitimate business reasons for traveling to the new reservation, creating opportunities for continued contact. Most importantly, they could work to ensure that the children who had grown up together would not lose touch completely. "It won't be the same," Margaret acknowledged, "but it might preserve the most important elements of what we've built here. And it might keep people out of federal prison," added Thomas pragmatically. Over the following weeks, both communities threw themselves into planning with the same cooperative spirit that had characterized their response to every previous challenge. But this time, The obstacle they faced was not a natural disaster or bureaucratic investigation. It was the deliberate destruction of their way of life by people who had never seen what they had accomplished together. Running Wolf and several other Lakota men made scouting trips to the designated reservation, returning with troubling reports. The land was poor, the water sources unreliable, and the existing tribes already struggling with overcrowding and resource scarcity. Government promises of supplies and support appeared to be largely unfulfilled, leaving relocated populations dependent on inadequate rations and increasingly desperate. "They are not relocating us," Running Wolf reported grimly after his second scouting trip. "They are imprisoning us in a place where we cannot sustain ourselves, then blaming us when we fail to thrive." Meanwhile, Margaret and Thomas worked with other settler families to establish legitimate business connections that could justify future travel to the reservation. They formed a trading company specifically designed to purchase traditional crafts and provide supplies to relocated populations. The enterprise would operate within federal guidelines while maintaining the personal relationships that had become so important to both communities. The most heartbreaking challenge involved the children. Young people who had grown up considering each other siblings would be separated by hundreds of miles and legal barriers that made continued contact difficult and dangerous. Parents from both communities struggled to explain to their children why friendships that had enriched everyone's lives were suddenly being treated as criminal activity. "Sarah Anderson cried for an hour when I told her Bright Feather was leaving," Jim Anderson reported during one of their planning meetings. "She doesn't understand why people who help each other have to be kept apart." "Children understand truth better than adults sometimes," observed Morning Star. "They see clearly what we complicate with fears and regulations." As the deadline approached, both communities organized a farewell gathering that would also serve as a commitment ceremony for their ongoing connection. Despite the forced separation, they wanted to formalize their intention to maintain their relationships within whatever legal boundaries existed. The ceremony took place at the Warm Springs on a crisp October evening, with representatives from every family that had participated in their cross-cultural experiment. The setting was perfect. The place where Margaret and Running Wolf had first found refuge together, where their communities had held countless meetings, where children from both cultures had played together while their parents conducted business and shared stories. Running Wolf spoke first, his words carrying the weight of profound change and uncertain futures. "This place holds our best memories and our strongest friendships. Distance and laws cannot destroy what we have built here unless we allow them to. We carry these connections in our hearts, and we will find ways to honor them despite the barriers others place in our path." Margaret responded with her own commitment, speaking for the settler families who had been transformed by their unlikely partnerships. "We promise that this separation is not abandonment. We will find ways to maintain our bonds, to support each other across whatever distances are imposed, and to ensure that our children know the truth about what is possible when people choose cooperation over conflict." The ceremony included exchanges of gifts that would serve as permanent reminders of their connections. Lakota families presented settler friends with carefully crafted items that represented their cultural heritage: beadwork, carved pipes, hunting tools made with traditional techniques. Settler families offered practical items that could be useful in the difficult transition ahead: medical supplies, tools, clothing that would help during the challenging relocation process. Most significantly, they established a communication system that would allow them to maintain contact despite the physical separation. Messages could be passed through the trading company, letters could be sent through sympathetic intermediaries, and emergency communications could use smoke signals visible across long distances. "We are not saying goodbye," Running Wolf declared. As the ceremony concluded, "We are saying until we meet again, because if we meet again, we will, one way or another." The actual departure took place on a grey November morning that seemed fitting for such a sorrowful occasion. Wagons loaded with possessions and families prepared for the long journey south, while settler friends gathered to offer final assistance and support. Margaret watched as children from both communities exchanged tearful farewells, promising to write letters and maintain friendships that had become central to their young lives. Adults embraced with the careful formality of people trying to maintain composure in the face of profound loss. Star Dancer, now fully recovered from her winter injury, would make the journey south carrying Running Wolf and his family toward an uncertain future. The mare had become a symbol of survival and resilience, and her presence offered some comfort. During this difficult transition, as the convoy of families began moving south, Margaret felt as though she was watching the destruction of something precious and irreplaceable. The community they had built through cooperation and mutual respect was being dismantled by people who had never witnessed its benefits or understood its significance. But even as she grieved for what was being lost, Margaret refused to despair completely. The relationships they had forged had changed everyone involved, creating understanding and respect that would endure despite physical separation. The children who had grown up together would carry those experiences into adulthood, potentially influencing future generations in ways that government policies could not control. That evening, as she stood alone at the warm springs where so much of their community building had taken place, Margaret made a solemn promise to herself and to the friends who were now traveling toward an uncertain future. She would find ways to honor the connections they had built, to support the people who had enriched her life immeasurably, and to preserve the lessons they had learned about human nature and the possibilities for cooperation across cultural boundaries. The smoke from the springs rose into the darkening sky as it had for countless years, indifferent to human laws and government policies. Like the friendships that had been forged in this place, some things were too fundamental to be destroyed by official decree. They might change form, adapt to new circumstances, or operate through different channels, but their essential nature would endure. Margaret turned toward home, carrying with her the conviction that their experiment in cross-cultural cooperation had planted seeds that would eventually bloom again, despite all attempts to prevent their growth. The letter that had brought such devastating news had also revealed the power of what they had accomplished. Why else would distant bureaucrats work so hard to destroy something they claimed was meaningless? Winter was coming again, bringing with it the harsh conditions that had first brought her and Running Wolf together. But this winter would be different, marked by separation and loss rather than discovery and cooperation. Still, Margaret faced it with the confidence that came from having survived previous challenges through courage, resourcefulness, and the support of unexpected friends. The warm springs would continue flowing through the frozen months ahead, maintaining their promise of life and renewal even in the harshest conditions. Like the friendships that had been forged here, they represented proof that some forms of warmth could endure even the coldest seasons, waiting for the right moment to nurture new growth and new possibilities for human connection. 5 years had passed since the forced relocation, and Margaret stood once again at the warm springs. But this time, she was not alone. Beside her stood a young woman with long, dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to hold both cultures within their depths. Running Wolf's daughter, Singing Bird, now grown into adulthood despite the hardships of reservation life. The reunion had been planned for months through their carefully maintained network of communications, timed to coincide with a legitimate trading expedition that provided legal cover for the gathering. Margaret's heart swelled as she watched families from both communities emerge from the surrounding forest, moving with the cautious hope of people reclaiming something precious they had thought lost forever. Thomas appeared first, leading a pack horse, loaded with supplies for the trading company they had established. Behind him came the Anderson family, including Sarah, now 11 years old, and clutching a letter she had written in both English and Lakota for her childhood friend Bright Feather. The Walsh brothers followed with their wives and children, all bearing gifts and messages for Lakota friends they hadn't seen in years. From the opposite direction, Running Wolf emerged from the tree line, his hair now streaked with premature gray that spoke of hard years on the reservation. But his step was firm and his eyes bright as he recognized the familiar faces gathered around the springs that had once been their regular meeting place. Star Dancer accompanied him, the mare now showing her age, but still carrying herself with dignity. The horse had become something of a legend on the reservation, her survival story told and retold as an example of resilience and the power of unlikely alliances. "Margaret," Running Wolf said simply, but his voice carried volumes of shared history and enduring friendship. "Running Wolf," she replied, stepping forward to embrace him with the unself-conscious warmth of someone greeting a brother. "You look well, considering everything. Reservation life is hard, but we survive. Your letters and supplies have helped more than you know." The gathering that followed was both joyful and poignant, as people who had been separated by government policy reconnected with friends who had become family during their years of cooperation. Children who had been toddlers during the relocation were now young adults, while teenagers had matured into responsible men and women shaped by adversity, but not broken by it. Bright Feather, now a confident young woman of 16, immediately sought out Sarah Anderson. Despite the years of separation, their friendship resumed as if no time had passed, the two girls switching effortlessly between English and Lakota as they shared stories of their different experiences. "She has not forgotten you, Singing Bird," told Margaret, gesturing toward her younger sister. "Every letter you sent was read many times, shared with everyone. Your words kept hope alive during the darkest times." Margaret felt tears threatening as she absorbed the full impact of Singing Bird's statement. The letters she had sent through their trading company network had been intended as simple gestures of friendship, but they had apparently served as lifelines for people struggling to maintain their identity and dignity under impossible circumstances. "Tell me about the reservation," she said. "Your father's letters suggested conditions were difficult, but I want to understand what you've actually endured." What Singing Bird described was worse than Margaret had imagined. The promised government, supplies rarely arrived, and when they did, they were often spoiled or inadequate. The land could not support the number of people forced to live on it, leading to chronic hunger and competition for resources with other displaced tribes. Disease had swept through the overcrowded camps repeatedly, killing elders who held irreplaceable knowledge and children who represented the future. The government schools established to civilize native children systematically attempted to destroy their cultural identity, punishing them for speaking their own language or practicing traditional customs. "But we adapt," Singing Bird continued with quiet pride. "Grandfather teaches traditional ways in secret. Mothers pass down old stories. Children learn to survive in white man's world without forgetting who they are." "Your father mentioned that some families have been allowed to leave the reservation temporarily for seasonal work," Thomas interjected. "Is that how you managed to come here?" Running Wolf nodded. "Official policy has softened slightly. Men can leave for harvest work, for trading expeditions, for activities that benefit white communities. So I become a trader, and my family assists with business." The irony was unmistakable. The government that had forced separation now permitted limited contact when it served economic interests. But Running Wolf and his people had learned to work within such contradictions, finding ways to preserve what mattered most, despite official obstacles. "What about the children?" Margaret asked, watching as young people from both communities tentatively began renewing old friendships. "How have they fared?" "Better than expected," admitted White Elk, who had joined their conversation. "The ones who grew up here, who remember how different peoples can live together. They carry that knowledge. They teach it to younger ones, even when government teachers tell them such cooperation is impossible." Margaret observed the interactions around the springs, noting how naturally the children fell back into their old patterns of shared games and mutual learning. A Lakota boy was teaching a settler girl how to identify edible plants, while a white teenager showed his Indian counterpart techniques for repairing metal tools. The adults, meanwhile, were conducting serious business despite the emotional nature of their reunion. The trading company had evolved into a substantial enterprise that provided genuine economic benefits to both communities. Lakota craftsmen created goods that found eager markets in growing frontier towns, while settler families provided access to manufactured items that reservation life made difficult to obtain. "Your business model is being noticed," Thomas told Running Wolf. "Other regions are starting to establish similar arrangements. What we began here might be spreading." "Good," Running Wolf replied. "Proves that cooperation works better than conflict, even when the government tries to prevent it." As evening approached, the gathered families prepared for the ceremony that would mark the true purpose of their reunion. 5 years of separation had tested their bonds, but had not broken them. Tonight, they would formally renew their commitment to maintaining their friendship, despite whatever obstacles might be placed in their path. Margaret found herself thinking of the chain of events that had led to this moment, tracing the connections. Back to that winter day when she had seen mysterious smoke and made the dangerous decision to investigate. Every choice since then had built upon that initial act of moral courage, creating ripples that now affected dozens of families and potentially influenced policy across the territory. The ceremony began with Running Wolf's grandfather, now ancient, but still commanding in his presence, speaking in Lakota about the bonds that connected all people to the land and to each other. His words were translated by Singing Bird, whose education in both cultures allowed her to bridge linguistic and conceptual differences. Grandfather says that 5 winters ago, 2 strangers helped each other survive, and from that small act grew something larger than either could have imagined. He says this is how change happens, not through great battles or powerful speeches, but through individual people choosing to help each other when help is needed. Margaret was asked to respond, representing the settler families who had been equally transformed by their unlikely partnership. She spoke of lessons learned about survival, community, and the false barriers that people allowed to separate them from potential friends and allies. "We have learned that survival is not just about enduring hardship," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "It is about recognizing that our fates are connected, that helping others ultimately helps ourselves, and that the courage to extend trust across cultural boundaries creates strength that no individual family could achieve alone." The formal business of the evening involved renewing their trading agreements and communication networks, but also establishing new arrangements that reflected changed circumstances. Several young adults from both communities expressed interest in spending extended time with their counterparts, learning skills and perspectives that could benefit their respective peoples. Most significantly, they discussed plans for a permanent school that would serve both communities, teaching children practical skills while preserving cultural knowledge from both traditions. The school would operate during summer months, when families could more easily travel, providing education that government institutions failed to offer. Such a school would be revolutionary, observed Jim Anderson. Teaching Indian and white children together, sharing knowledge from both cultures, preparing them for a world where cooperation might be normal rather than exceptional. Revolution sometimes begins with small steps taken by ordinary people, Running Wolf replied. Our children deserve better than the fear and separation their parents inherited. As the formal ceremony concluded, families began the process of saying goodbye once again, though this parting felt different from the devastating separation 5 years earlier. They now had proof that their bonds could survive official opposition, distance, and time. More importantly, they had established practical systems for maintaining their connections and supporting each other across whatever barriers might be erected. Margaret embraced Singing Bird, marveling at the young woman's poise and wisdom despite the hardships she had endured. You have your father's strength and your grandfather's wisdom, she said. The future of both our peoples may depend on young leaders like you, and on older ones who had courage to take risks for strangers, Singing Bird replied. Your choice to help my father created everything that followed. We do not forget such debts. As the Lakota families prepared for their return journey to the reservation, Margaret realized that their experiment in cross-cultural cooperation had evolved beyond her wildest expectations. What had begun as a simple act of human compassion had grown into a model for relationships that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial separation and cultural conflict. The trading company continued to thrive, providing economic opportunities for both communities while maintaining the personal connections that had made everything possible. The communication network they had established served as a model for other regions, attempting to preserve relationships across imposed boundaries. Most importantly, the children who had grown up together during their brief period of open cooperation were now adults who carried different expectations about what was possible between peoples. They understood that cultural differences could be resources to be shared rather than barriers to be maintained. Standing alone at the warm springs after the last families had departed, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had ventured into a blizzard to investigate mysterious smoke had been transformed by the experience into someone who understood that individual moral choices could create social change that rippled far beyond their immediate consequences. The springs continued their eternal flow, maintaining life in the harsh Dakota winters, just as the relationships forged here had maintained hope through political winters that tried to freeze human connections. The water that bubbled up from deep underground had no regard for the boundaries humans drew on maps or the laws they passed to regulate behavior. Like friendship itself, the springs simply continued, offering warmth and renewal to anyone willing to seek them out. Thomas appeared beside her as she stood in contemplation, his presence as comforting and familiar as the landscape they had learned to call home. "Satisfied with the evening?" he asked. "More than satisfied," Margaret replied, taking his hand as they turned toward their cabin. "We've proven that some things are stronger than the forces that try to divide us. Think our school idea will work? I think people who can survive Dakota winters and government interference can probably manage to educate their children properly," she said with quiet confidence. As they walked home under stars that had witnessed countless human struggles and triumphs, Margaret understood that their story was far from over. The challenges that had brought her and Running Wolf together had revealed possibilities that would continue expanding as long as people had the courage to help strangers, to bridge cultural differences, and to insist that human connection was more powerful than the barriers designed to prevent it. The warm springs would continue flowing through whatever winters lay ahead, just as the friendships forged there would continue growing despite whatever obstacles might arise. Some forms of warmth once discovered proved impossible to extinguish. In the distance, a column of steam rose from the springs into the star-filled sky, visible to anyone who knew where to look, a signal that hope endured, that cooperation was possible, and that sometimes the most important changes began with the simple decision to help someone in need, regardless of the consequences that might follow. The smoke Margaret had seen years ago during that first blizzard had led her to Running Wolf, but it had also led both their communities toward a different understanding of what survival could mean when people chose to see each other as neighbors rather than strangers. That understanding would continue spreading, carried by children who had learned to play together, by adults who had learned to work together, and by the simple, revolutionary idea that human beings could choose cooperation over conflict, even in the harshest circumstances. The story that began with a woman's moral courage in a snowstorm had become something larger, proof that individual choices could reshape the world, one relationship at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.